And of course, this is just the latest incremental grinding away at the freedoms that we continue to see erode in Hong Kong, right? Given how much has changed over the past few months in terms of Beijing's approach to Hong Kong, what is the end game here?
Well, I think the end game is to render Hong Kong politically the same as other mainland cities, meaning that it will have institutions that are not democratic and provide no check on the government, that will limit civic activism, that will have an increasingly quiescent judiciary and a weak, if still existed, free press. You know, the end game is to really snuff out dissent.
So with the resignation of the pro-democracy lawmakers we've seen this week, is this really a death knell for the pro-democracy movement, which we know has had its share of struggles already, even before this week?
Yeah, it's certainly not a good sign. Two pro-Dems have said that they will stay in LegCo. But I think the end game for LegCo as an institution is to ensure that by the time elections are held next fall, they've been postponed for a year, you know, that only individuals who are acceptable to the Hong Kong and Beijing authorities are allowed to run and actually allowed to take up their seats. You know, and their legislative agenda will not include anything that challenges either of those authorities. In short, you know, LegCo will come to be more like the National People's Congress in Beijing than the democratic legislature it was meant to be.
How much has the international community done to address human rights issues in China, and how much more needs to be done?
Well, we've seen governments certainly speak up and condemn moves like these, do things like suspend the extradition treaties they have with Hong Kong in the wake of the national security law being imposed by Beijing. You know, open up channels for people to emigrate or seek asylum. The U.S. has imposed some targeted individual sanctions on people like Carrie Lam and some of the mainland officials responsible for Hong Kong policy. But I think we haven't seen the kind of coordinated response, particularly around tools like sanctions, which are more effective when they're multilateral, you know, or the kind of pursuit of accountability for Chinese and Hong Kong government officials who are committing or complicit in serious human rights violations. You know, that's the kind of response that you would see to human rights violations of this scope and scale committed by other governments. There's a reluctance to challenge China. But I think that tide is actually starting to change a little bit because of what's happened in Hong Kong, but also what's happened in Xinjiang and around some other issues too.
The Trump administration has not necessarily focused on human rights during its time in office. Do you expect that to change with the Biden administration, and how much can we expect of American leadership, especially on the multilateral front, which you say has lacked so far?
Yeah, I think we can expect a Biden administration to pursue international responses and to return to supporting and participating in key multilateral institutions, particularly within the UN system. The question, though, is whether a really rights-respecting internationalist U.S. administration will come together with other governments to provide the kind of counterweight to the threat that China poses on human rights issues. I should say the Chinese government poses both inside and outside the country. You know, these are much greater challenges than when some of the Biden administration, likely Biden administration officials who'd served before, you know, were dealing with, 4 and 8 years ago. It's a very different landscape now.
Sophie, I want to get some of your views on the latest situation in Xinjiang. How problematic is it for the corporate world when a company like Volkswagen continues to defend operating its car plants in the region?
It's deeply problematic. Look, we've written recently about auditing firms that have now announced that they won't even try to operate in the region because they can't get the kind of access they need to make credible determinations that serious human rights violations are not taking place. You know, and so for companies to keep insisting that, you know, they've not found any problems, I think only raises questions about who they were asking. Were they asking people who could answer the questions honestly? You know, are they going through some charade of due diligence, or are they actually trying to do the real thing? And if in fact they can't do robust due diligence, can they really be confident that their supply chains are clean? And are they really willing to wear the reputational risk of profiting from Uyghur repression?
A lot of the times these businesses are not willing to speak up, and even governments, because we have seen China cutting business ties or imposing sanctions on goods coming from different countries. What's the risk of this censorship by China spreading beyond its borders?
Oh, I think there is a real risk, and we've seen examples in recent years, of governments and companies capitulating to Chinese government pressure, even in their home countries, and asking companies or companies themselves, without even being asked, censoring their ads or their spokespeople, or firing people who work for them who've taken what the companies think are positions that the Chinese government won't like. I think that's a real problem. Corporations should not be rewarded for playing by the rules of authoritarian governments in rights-respecting jurisdictions. That's, I think, a very alarming trend. And I think shareholders and consumers need to be mindful of this conduct and act accordingly.